What's up, everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. Today, we're going to look at a very important topic that has come up in our culture recently, and that is the topic of the death penalty. We've had a couple of cases that have gained national prominence and attention that have outraged the populace for the most part, both conservative and liberal, both Christian and non-Christian. People are outraged by the crimes that we've seen in the past week or so, 10 days, 2 weeks, something to that effect. And so what we want to do today is explore the concept of the death penalty and ask the question of whether or not a modern society has the right to impose the death penalty or capital punishment upon those who commit very violent and heinous crimes. Of course, for those of us who are Christians, those of us who love Christ and follow the Lord and want to ostensibly honor what the Scriptures teach about these things, we want to have our minds and our worldviews fully informed by what the Bible teaches. So what I thought I would do in this video is that I would consult one of the great Reformed theologians of our day, namely John Frame, who has been a longtime professor, trained many of us Reformed and Presbyterian pastors over the years. John Frame is well acclaimed for his work in systematic theology. He wrote his magnum opus, a work of systematic theology, as well as his 4-volume Theology of Lordship series, as well as great works on philosophy and a number of other topics. I should tell you right off the bat that John Frame is one of my professors, and one of my professors that I greatly admire. And so when Frame teaches on a particular topic, I do tend to listen up. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is going through his teaching on capital punishment in this book right here, The Doctrine of the Christian Life, which is volume 4 of his Theology of Lordship series. And particularly in this series, what John Frame does is he works through the 10 Commandments, amongst other things, trying to exposit and to tease out the Bible's application, especially as it relates to the law of God. So in this particular video, we're going to be looking at Frame's teaching on the 6th commandment, which is do not murder. In order to do that, let's go ahead and share screen and get started with our topic. The two cases that have absolutely outraged us in recent days are, first of all, this one, Irina Zutskaya, who's this beautiful blonde-haired young woman here from the Ukraine who came here to North Carolina to make a better life for herself. She worked at a pizza shop, and on this particular occasion, just several days ago from the time I'm recording this video, she was brutally stabbed and murdered by this particularly heinous individual here standing over her, this man in the red hoodie. He is a black man. He has long dreads, and he is sitting there behind her in the train, looking peaceably, though perhaps a little bit agitated, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, with absolutely zero provocation, he takes out what looks to be a penknife or a pocket knife and brutally stabs this woman in the neck multiple times. You've seen the videos, or at least the still shots. Personally, I could not get myself to watch the video. It was just too heartbreaking for me to see this. It was just too heinous, violent, disgusting, and even more disgusting is not only the brutality of this murder of this black man upon this innocent-looking young woman who had zero to do with him. No offense, no agitation on her part to try to offend this particular individual. This murder took place out of nowhere, lightning quick, stabs her in the neck, and she bleeds out right there on this public train. Adding insult to injury in this particular case, a number of people who were sitting right around Irina Zutskaya did absolutely nothing to either stop it or to help her as she mercilessly bled out on the train. Meanwhile, the particular perpetrator of this event, he exits the train dripping with blood and is therefore later arrested. Now, the question is, what, if anything, is going to happen to him? Because this man has been arrested some 14 times previously and usually gets out with very little punishment, perhaps a slap on the wrist, as they say, a little bit of public charity work or something like that, which who knows if that even had to be carried out. Usually sort of this kind of no bail release that's very typical now of democratic, very liberal, kind of secular-minded, atheistic worldview governance in some of our blue states, and particularly our blue city. So one wonders if anything is going to happen to this man. But the question in this video is not what will happen to him, but what should happen to him. And specifically, we want to know if capital punishment or the death penalty is fitting in this case. Well, the other case, obviously, is the brutal assassination-style murder of Charlie Kirk by this man right here, Tyler Robinson. Now, just yesterday, as I'm filming this particular video, more damning evidence of Tyler Robinson's guilt of having been the lone shooter of Charlie Kirk has come out in the form of text messages and other evidence. Interestingly, though, this case looks like it's swelling to be more of a conspiracy in which multiple individuals might have been involved in the killing of Charlie Kirk. We're just going to have to wait as time comes. But again, we have a cold-blooded assassination-style shooting of a man who did nothing to deserve it, Charlie Kirk, who's simply there to talk to students and perhaps engage them in worldview considerations, talk some politics, talk some Christianity, some religion, and he is shot from 150, 200 yards away by this man, Tyler Robinson, who is known to associate with his gay lover, a trans furry individual, and what we know about this at the moment is that Tyler Robinson killed Charlie Kirk because he was a Christian and because he didn't like his worldview. He didn't like his politics. And so again, we ask the question of what should happen to these individuals. Is there any such case in which the death penalty should be imposed? Now, even as I say this, just yesterday, it was announced by the governor of Utah, the prosecutor in this case, that they will be pursuing the death penalty for Tyler Robinson. And in the state of Utah, they still do have the death penalty of death by firing squad. Now, I'm not sure how often that's used, if ever anymore, but it looks like they are going to pursue that. And it was announced at his arraignment just yesterday that very much the prosecution intends to do that very thing. So what we're going to do is get some help here on this topic from John Frame. Again, he's a well-trained Reformed theologian, taught at Westminster Theological Seminary. He taught at Reformed Theological Seminary, where I had him in Orlando. And we're looking here at his book, The Doctrine of the Christian Life, the Theology of Lordship series, particularly pages 694 to 704, if you want to follow along with me in this short video. Well, one of the things that Frame does that I think is helpful is he begins by asking the question of why we have punishment at all in the first place. Why don't we let criminals run loose? Why don't we just shake our fists at the sky when violent things happen and perhaps say a few more thoughts and prayers? Well, Frame says, no, actually, there's very good biblical motives for imposing just punishment on offenders. And he names 6 reasons why we might want to impose, as a society, severe penalties on criminals. And he lists them 1 through 6, with number 5 having an asterisk next to it because Frame is concerned that this would be misused. But the other 5 he does think have biblical precedent. So number 1, let's go through these. Deterrent. One of the reasons that we punish people who commit crimes is to deter other people from committing the same crime. Okay, so if I commit a crime and I'm visibly punished by society, then what that does ostensibly is it deters other people from committing that same crime. In other words, hey, Johnny got punished very severely for doing his crime. I don't want to experience the same punishment that Johnny received. Therefore, I'm less likely to do that particular thing. So Frame thinks here that there's a strong motive for punishment in the mode of deterrence, that this provides some sort of a speed bump, we might say, for other people desiring to commit the same crime. Secondly, perhaps more importantly, and perhaps even more Christianly, though he does think that deterrence and these next ones are biblical, reformation. One of the reasons why we want to punish people is that so they would change, so that they would reform. Now, we might here think about specifically church discipline, because the entire purpose of church discipline is to glorify God and honor Christ and to defend his honor in the church, inasmuch as we try to lead somebody to repentance and to life change. So Frame thinks that the reformation of the criminal's heart is a wonderful goal to aim at, and the things that we do should then be inculcated in society so that reformation can possibly be brought about. Now, as you and I know, some particular people are very difficult to reform and are very resistant to those kinds of measures. And so, therefore, we move on to other kinds of punishment, namely, third, restitution. Now, in restitution, we don't have so much the destruction of the evil deed doer as we do the recompense of the victim of the crime. So for instance, in the example of stealing, if a person is caught thieving or larceny or some other kinds of perhaps economic crimes, one of the reasons that we punish that person is so as to bring about a restitution to the person who has been committed against. So if you steal, then you ought to repay. And in the scripture, sometimes you ought to repay double what it is that you've stolen, so that you have not only a restitution to the person who is the victim, but you also have deterrence from other people doing it again. Okay? Next, we have restraint. Now, here we have to get pretty serious, because in restraints, what we're doing is we're actually removing an individual from society. What we're saying here is that this particular person is so dangerous that we have to restrain them from the rest of the body politic of society, so that they can no longer have opportunity to inflict harm and damage upon that particular person. Typically, in the American justice system, we think here of prison, though Frame is going to have some pointed thoughts about the use of prison and how it can certainly be misused. But these would be those examples where in the scriptures it says that a person ought to be cut off from the people of Israel. Now, it's not entirely clear in some of those texts when it refers to being cut off, whether or not we're talking about banishing the person, exiling the person, or whether that involves the death penalty itself. Fifth, John Frame brings up the possibility of taxation, and he says, interestingly enough, that he can't really find any biblical support for number 5, taxation, though we certainly do use that as a profit motive today. And so Frame gives the example of speeding tickets, wherein even speed traps by the use of cameras and so forth, where the main purpose seems to be to fund local city or state governments by taxing people for committing crimes. Now, in a sense, that example might also serve as a deterrent, perhaps even reformation. It's not entirely clear how that would be in a restitution or a restraint unless the person loses their license or something like that. But Frame thinks this is sort of a modern corruption of the motives of punishment. And then finally, retribution. This would simply be because we punish the person because they deserve it. We live in a moral universe. We live in a just universe, and sin deserves death. Sin deserves punishment. And so sometimes, if all of these other motives are lost or impossible, we should still carry out just punishment because of number 6, retribution. The person deserves to be punished. And there seems to be something intrinsically unjust or unjust if we don't punish the guilty person, whether or not we're ever able to, for instance, reform their hearts or to stop other people from doing the same crime or so forth, okay? So as it comes to capital punishment or the death penalty, one of the things that John Frame does in his chapter is he points out the fact that the death penalty is intrinsic to the scriptures even before the giving of the Sinai law. So we think of the giving of the Sinai law, especially in the book of Exodus, chapter 20 and so forth, and then certainly on into Deuteronomy, including the Levitical codes and so forth. But even before Moses receives the law on Sinai and gives it to the people of Israel as governance for the body politic of the people of God, we do see the death penalty implied, and sometimes even more than implied, but explicitly stated. So for instance, in Genesis 9, 6-7, it says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And so one of the things that we see here is that life, human life, is so valuable to God because God made man in his own image, that therefore, especially here, the implication is the shedding of blood. The crime here in view is murder, that the just penalty for murder then is also the capital punishment or the death penalty of that particular man. And therefore, then the scripture goes on to say, "And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it." Now, somebody might say, well, doesn't that in itself violate the 6th commandment, you shall not kill? But no, because in the Hebrew, in the 6th commandment and the 10 commandments, the word there for kill does not preclude every kind of killing. So for instance, there's obviously killing related to animals for food. There's killing of the animals related to temple sacrifice. There's killing that's commendable, as for instance in battle or in war. And so yes, the death penalty is also still allowable and in fact encouraged by other places in the law. We're going to give some examples of that here in just a moment. Now, one of the things that Frame says that I think is interesting here is that he actually commends more to modern society the use of beatings. Now, we don't typically use beatings at all anymore. In America, that's often considered a cruel and unusual punishment, though it's not entirely clear that the original writers of the Constitution had cruel and unusual punishment in terms of beatings necessarily in mind. Now, you could certainly make a beating cruel, definitely, no question about that. But what about something like a caning that they do in Singapore and other places where they have very, very, very low crime rates? Well, Frame says this on page 700, beatings, especially in public, are of great deterrent value, and they are far preferable to prison sentences in that they deal with the issue quickly and do not expose the offender to prison culture. So Frame here in this chapter is really going to say quite a few very, very negative things about prison. He does not think that prison, long-term prison sentences are really going to be the best, either in deterring because it's sort of out of view of the public. So, we kind of know about prison, at least theoretically, we know they're prisons. We drive by one every once in a while. On TV shows, we see people in orange jumpsuits and so forth. But because it's sort of removed from the view of public life for the most part, he doesn't think that it has great deterrent value. And not only that, but Frame thinks that prisons do not serve usually for the reformation of the heart of the person, but rather they actually make the person far more corrupt. Because in prisons, what usually happens is that people experience a great amount of violence, molestation, rape, and so forth. And usually what happens as they're subject to gang violence and gang life and so forth, they come out far more dangerous people at the end of their prison term than they went in the first place. So Frame suggests, and perhaps he's right here, that beatings, public canings and so forth, actually have a better deterrent value because we see the severity of that punishment. Not only that, but they're quick, okay, so they can take place rather immediately. You don't have to spend millions of dollars on any one particular inmate over perhaps years and even decades in the incarceration system. And therefore, that the person would less likely be further corrupted by all of the dark, insidious nature of prison life itself, okay? Now, Frame also has another negative thing to say about prison. He says, on prison, significantly imprisonment, the major form of punishment today, is entirely absent from the Mosaic law. Okay, so there you go. Have you thought about that? Where do we see prison terms imposed in the Scriptures? Well, there isn't really something like that. Now, just kind of off top of mind, one of the things that we might think about is like the cities of refuge for those who commit manslaughter. But that's a little bit different because in those sections in the law, if somebody commits manslaughter, which is not an intentional murder, it's one of those things where you accidentally kill somebody. And I think the Scripture gives an example of like an axe head flying off the handle and killing somebody by mistake. But there's negligence, right? Why were you using that axe that was in such bad repair? Well, the person in this case can go to a city of refuge so that the victim of that crime of negligence, their family does not pursue you unto death, and therefore you get in sort of this negative cycle of retributive, violent, interpersonal kind of justice. So Frame thinks that our major emphasis on prison today is fundamentally misguided because he doesn't see that as a major form of deterrent, restitution, punishment, or reformation in the Scriptures. Okay? So back to capital punishment or the death penalty, what Frame says is that capital punishment should be used more often, both because of its inherent justice and because executing the worst criminals prevents the development of a criminal class. And that is exactly what we're seeing. Going back to the brutal murder of Irina Zhutskaya, this beautiful blonde Ukrainian woman who's just coming home from her work on a pizza shop shift, that was done by a professional criminal class individual who has contributed very, very, very little positively to society and continues to wreak havoc and injustice on the rest of the public. And Frame's point is actually capital punishment or the death penalty should probably be used more because what that does is it basically wipes out the bottom tier of the criminal class. Okay, so let's assume theoretically here that all people are on sort of like a strata of their contributions from good all the way down to the worst. Well, you don't use capital punishment on just anybody, obviously, but you do have kind of the worst of the worst, right? You and me, we're somewhere in the middle top, let's say, because we park in the wrong place or we get speeding infractions and so forth, but nobody's talking about the capital punishment for that kind of crime. But you do have this lower tier sort of dark ethos of those who live perpetually for the sake of violence. They love it, they thrill by it. And Frame especially mentions the more someone disrespects and disregards the rule of law, the more likely they are to basically sink down to this bottom rung of this entirely debased criminal class. And Frame says that capital punishment would serve society well by essentially eliminating the darkest of the dark, the most hatred of the hateful, as it were. So, as it relates to biblical ethics, then, what Frame does is he points out a number of cases in which the Bible explicitly commends the death penalty. And what you have here on the screen is not exhaustive. Frame, I think, gives a closer to exhaustive list on his section here, around page 700 or so, I think it is. But the Bible specifically mentions the death penalty for murder, for incest, for bestiality, rape, kidnapping, witchcraft, human sacrifice, and false gods. Okay, so what we see here is that these are the most serious of the kinds of crimes that we can perpetuate on humanity, especially and including murder, but also some of these really, really nasty, heinous kind of sexualized crimes here as well. Those, Frame would suggest, are also likely subjects to the death penalty or capital punishment. Okay, now just a few other thoughts on Frame's part here before we wrap up this video. First thing that's really interesting is Frame says there ought to be a place for what he calls Christian prisons. So just like we have Christian soup kitchens and Christian hospitals and Christian schools, Frame does at least tease the idea that there should be something like a Christian prison. Now, I'm not sure how this would work out or how it would be funded. In fact, Frame doesn't really work out the details here either. But he does suggest that perhaps if, and maybe I'm reading between the lines here, if the nation was more Christian, or perhaps some of our states were more Christianized, that there could be something like intentionally Christian prisons that really do seek the spiritual change, the conversion, the sanctification of the prisoners. And so because that doesn't currently exist, Frame does say that Christians should really do the work of Christian prison ministries. And as much as the prisons are really wretched places, we should at least be trying to reach, care for, minister, proclaim the gospel to those in prison ministries. Now, Frame does take up the greatest objection to the death penalty, and that would be the unintentional execution of innocent people. He takes this up on page 703. So I think we all know that one of the risks of capital punishment is occasionally you end up basically subjecting somebody to the electric chair or the gas chamber or intravenous execution or whatever form you may have, firing squad, whatever. Occasionally what happens is you put somebody to death only to later find out that, oops, it wasn't the right guy. Maybe some DNA evidence, some fingerprint evidence comes to the fore, and it's clear that you actually executed the wrong person. Well, that would be the strongest argument Frame thinks against the death penalty, but nevertheless, Frame still thinks that all things considered, the few times that you do that, compared to the many times that you would put to death the worst of the worst, the absolute mongrels among us, that it would still be a net positive and gain for society to use capital punishment more often. So he says, capital punishment is not perfect justice, but it is part of the process by which God brings his judgment to bear on a sinful world. And I think he's right about that. Well, one of the most interesting things I think in the chapter that Frame says that we don't really use then is the deterrence of public beatings. Perhaps if you think about these two cases that we started off with, this brutal killer on the train who stabs Irina Zutskaya right in the neck multiple times for zero reasons, perhaps an individual like that should be publicly caned, or perhaps somebody like Tyler Robinson could be publicly caned as a deterrence, but also a retribution, perhaps even bringing about some reformation. And in that way, we would not have to either use the really expensive permanent prison system or some other very expensive forms of temporary penal justice. Okay, well, that's all I've got for you today. Again, the book that I'm referring to here is The Doctrine of the Christian Life by John Frame. I'll post this in a link in the description of this video if you want to grab it. Thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.